All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Osama Abi Murshid, professor of history in the department here at Georgetown University. And I'm very pleased to chair the second panel on revolutions, rebellion, uprisings, or authoritarian survival, understanding political change in the Arab world. And I'm very privileged to be sitting here with two of the foremost specialists on this topic, and I will refer you to the biographical sheet for more detailed information. But for now, I'll very briefly introduce my colleagues Mohammed Bamia from the University of Pittsburgh, who will be delivering a paper entitled From Old Nationalism to New Patriotism, a preliminary sketch of the ideology of the Arab revolutions. And he will be followed by Asla Bali from UCLA, whose paper is entitled Uprisings, Intervention in the Arab World After 2011. Sorry, I keep doing that. All right, so without further delay, please, Professor Bamia.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. This image up here summarizes pretty much my presentation, and I will try to spend the next 20-25 minutes talking about the parameters of it. My own interests were never really in the immediate consequences of revolutions, but rather in their long-term impact on the culture, right, of the societies in which they have happened. And there are many kind of dimensions of that cultural and ideological kind of transformation on which the revolutions are based and which they are also explicating in their own way further. I'll talk only about one of those dimensions, which is what I call new patriotism, which is the subject of a brief article I published on this theme back in the summer, and I will try to revisit some of the conclusion today. And in particular, how revolution would not have been possible, right, without some kind of a new sense of new patriotism, which is distinct from old nationalism, right, although related to it in ways that I would like to talk about. And also, this new patriotism is not at least to my mind, something that is to be thought of as a finished ideology, but rather as an ideology in progress. And it is really an opportunity for us that is revolutionary times to think about how kind of ideologies transform, come to life, are used in experimental rather than finished forms, and so on and so forth, and develop kind of a pragmatic kind of sense of them. Briefly, for me, patriotism is, generally speaking, a feeling of personal responsibility for a collective community. And in that, it is distinct from simply belonging or a sense of belonging to a community, right, as in sort of a classical nationalism. The sense of personal responsibility, right, for the community's salvation, that personal act, right, is necessary for than waiting for a particular agent to kind of do the historical mission, is really central to this kind of conception of patriotism that has developed, I think, as part or out of old Arab nationalism, not necessarily always in contradiction to it, but really out of the learning process that we have been going through over the last few decades. So central to this notion of new patriotism is that the salvation of community to which one belongs could only be performed by one's own effort, whereas in classic nationalism, as we see in classic sort of pan-Arab nationalism until just recent past, the salvation of the community basically requires some kind of messianic type of leader, right, who embodies the nation or stands in for its interests and perspective, or organizations that are kind of disciplined and structured around the ideology and disseminated in kind of into society, right, which invariably kind of, as we have seen, for example, in the case of the Ba'ath Party, end up establishing dictatorship and also leader cults in the final process. The older and more classic kind of conception of nationalism that we are used to in the Arab world up until this point, the ability of the leader, right, to kind of save kind of the nation or kind of restore its lost dignity, right? Or rights or what have you, gives basically the leader some kind of license for loyalty and to rule also, even dictatorially. Right? And the little person, so to speak, is saved from having to do anything about that. He is embodied basically in the spirit of the leader. And I did, in fact, try to, in a different article, to compare the Iranian Revolution, right, to the Arab Revolution, in the sense because I thought the Iranian Revolution was one of perhaps of the last, although it was not the Arab world technically, but the model was the same, right, in the sense of the, here we have the popular revolution, right, but of course the question of leadership and the clarity of it was much more kind of pronounced that we see in any of the Arab revolutions. And for me, that was really very interesting, right? How come we have this kind of messianic kind of environment, right, that is full of stories of heroism and sacrifice and martyrdom and intense emotionality, but yet you don't have really any kind of a savior, a great leader who stands in, right, and is actually accepted or is actually promoted basically as the face of the revolution anywhere. I think, contrary to a lot that was what is being said about the Arab Revolution, I think the absence of leadership and organization has been their strength. And in fact, it would have been impossible really for them to develop the way they have and mature, right, the way they have if they had a clear leadership and structure and organization. That, of course, in the short term means some weaknesses, organizational weaknesses that we all know. But in the long run, I think it's ultimately beneficial, right? Because the learning process that results from that absence, basically, which seems to be sort of almost willed, right, by the people who are involved in the revolution, who seem to be suspicious, right, by nature of any party or any leader, as you see here, is basically for a lot of people an opportunity to learn more about what the revolution is all about as the revolution is in process. The new patriotism is convivial, pluralist, pragmatic. It is coterminous with multiple loyalties. Whereas old nationalism is nervous, defensive, ideologically exclusive, right, and impervious to democracy, not as opposed to democracy, but democracy is besides the point, right, from the point of view of old nationalism. And there are, in modern Arab intellectual kind of writings, some indicators, right, of a thought process that was leading in that direction, and I don't want to actually assume too much causality here in the sense that someone actually in their thought system kind of caused this new patriotism to kind of emerge on the surface. But Ilyas Khoury, for example, almost 10 years ago, wrote an article about the third Arab Nahda, which he argued would be a democratic Nahda. He was not talking about the revolutions as we're talking about them now, or as we're witnessing them now, but the idea was sort of there, that this is really what we might see in the future would be a continuation of a long kind of a historical kind of a process of cultural rejuvenation that is based on learning of some kind of accumulation of learning of what previous Nahda experiments kind of have resulted in. Now, as mentioned, what Ilyas Khoury, of course, did not mention was, or did not kind of conceive of, like all of us, right, is that this third Nahda, if this is what we're witnessing right now, right, requires basically a new spirit of patriotism, but also seem to highlight and thrive, in fact, in the absence of leadership and unified kind of organization. And there are perhaps some reasons for that. And we can talk about why that might be the case a little bit more. I don't have time to go into all details of this phenomenon, which I think is perhaps historically unique, at least in modern history. One of them is that the existence of leaders changes the rules of the game. Right? That is the struggle when you have clear leaders, right, with clear features, they tend to kind of cause the struggle to go through them rather than through the sort of to speak the little person who sees himself or herself as the agent of the revolution directly. Second, leaders do not allow by their very presence, the revolution to be as radical as it could be or as it should be. And there are several examples of that. That is, anywhere, right, in the Arab world where you had some kind of party life, right, even a weak one, you tend to have, at least in the early stages of the revolution, kind of an attempt to negotiate with the existing parties. Right? And that happened even in Egypt. Right? Basically before the fall of Mubarak, where basically there was a question as to whether it was okay to negotiate with the regime before the fall of Mubarak, and the existing parties, most of them, including the Muslim Brotherhood, for a while agreed to negotiate, and for a while also were seen as not part of the revolution. But that experiment did not last very long. Right? In Yemen, of course, where you have actually a very strong kind of a party life, so to speak, right, historically, perhaps much more than anywhere else in the Arab world, you have a certain outcome that for many revolutions in the street is not a revolution, really, right? Not yet at least, right? But although there has been sort of some kind of radical change. But the presence of leaders and organization in a clear kind of way tends to actually give the regimes some kind of someone to negotiate with and someone to whom one can give concessions, which are impossible to kind of give to anyone if you don't have anyone to give them to ultimately. And as we know, Ben Ali, Mubarak, even Gaddafi, and Assad right now, all of these leaders kind of think of themselves as offering historic concessions, right, to the opposition. But in most cases, there's really no one to actually take those concessions and decide that they were enough. Right? Thirdly, organizations, from the point of view of the new patriotism, see here, tend to be seen as self-serving, right, and to contaminate the spirit of unity, or national unity. And this is a new thing, I think, right? Namely, the rejection of the idea of the parties, and during the revolutionary moment, but not necessarily afterwards, during the transitional period where a different kind of dynamic set in. And you can see that in places where, for example, in Jordan and Bahrain, where to the extent that the uprisings or demonstrations were identified with a clear political party, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or what have you, in Bahrain, you have a tendency for the revolution or the uprising to be seen as the property of a particular party rather than as the patrimony of the whole nation. Right? And often, sometimes, a few tactical kind of changes kind of change, right, that kind of spirit. For example, in Jordan, right, a very simple thing, like moving the center of the demonstrations to somewhere else in Amman, not beyond the Husseini Mosque, which was dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, caused the regime to be very nervous in a way that it was never when, of course, all the protests centered to the Husseini Mosque, because it could say that, well, this is just a Muslim Brotherhood kind of thing, right? And it's not. And of course, when the protests moved elsewhere in Amman, they were met with very heavy repression that you can see kind of in the earlier phases. Now, one of the things that is characteristic and really very surprising from a sociological point of view about this new patriotism is the notion of the people, which is in the title of this conference. Who are the people, right? Now, the people, as we know, is an abstraction. And when I was in Egypt, again, last December for an event at the Egyptian Philosophical Society, I said the people is an abstraction, and people got mad at me and said, well, it is, yeah, because ultimately, but the thing about this abstraction, right, which kind of sums up a great deal of diversity, social, individualistic, basically, and class and professional, or what have you, diversity in society, often is made sense of by being embodied in a leader figure or in a strong organization. And historically, you see that in the evolution of supermajorities that kind of followed great national revolutions. For example, the Wafd party in Egypt after the 1919 revolution, or, of course, the Nasser cult after the Suez crisis, right, where peoplehood, right, seemed to be when actually it seemed to express itself, right, in some kind of collective national demand or spirit, seem naturally to kind of be represented, right, by a group, organization, or a leader kind of that embodies that. We don't see that here. We have use of an abstraction, peoplehood, but really no effort and very little interest in embodying kind of that abstraction in any particular entity, whether a person or a group. And I think that has to do with the kind of the historical kind of memory that has developed that on the basis of from the kind of the history of modern Arab nationalism, which I could talk about a little bit more if there's time, but I'm kind of attentive to the limit of time right now because I have a lot of points to go through. Now, what is not part of the new patriotism? My thesis is not that everyone in the Arab world basically embraces this new spirit. This is not all. In fact, there are a lot of places where this is not all the case. For example, Lebanon, where I just came back from last night. And again, I confronted the same phenomenon that I observed in an earlier visit to Lebanon, which was that this is the country that is least revolutionary, basically, in the Arab world, for various reasons. Namely, and you can see that, by the way, people tend to analyze the Arab revolutions. First of all, there are two particular styles of thought that are kind of really very foreign to the new patriotism, but they are used often to analyze them. Right? One of them has to do with space, and the other has to do with time. First one, when you have a way of thinking, right, that analyzes the revolution in terms of external factors, right, such as the Syrian revolution is this or that because it is supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, right, what have you. Right? Again, this is a common way of thinking or it's a conspiracy, right, whatever. But namely, a style of thought where instead of actually looking at what is happening on the ground and highlighting that, basically, the kind of the thought process immediately goes to who the allies, right, of this movement are, right, and evaluate things in terms of their associations, not than in terms of what they are themselves, right, doing. The second has to do with consequences, right? Namely, after the fall of the regime, what would happen? Would we have an Islamic State? Would we have an American allied regime? Would we have this or that? And this is, of course, a legitimate kind of a question, but not from a revolutionary point of view. I don't know if people know that or not, but I was in Egypt all of the year last year during the revolution. And during it, I was talking to people outside of Egypt, and when they were asking me what would happen next, I felt surprised, because I thought, actually, that is an interesting question. I never thought about it. Right? And no one I talked to, in fact, in the middle of the revolutionary moment, thought about it. Right? From the middle of the revolutionary process and the revolutionary moment, the future does not seem to be as interesting as the present. The focus tends to be on the present moment itself, on observing the kind of qualities, right, and potentials that were unsuspected before, that are summed up in this name, the people, and a sense of surprise, right, and enjoyment, right, of what one is seeing, rather than on the consequences. Right? And I think that people who tend to highlight consequences, right, are really not the kind of people who do any revolutions. Right? Because if you sit down and begin to think about consequences that will happen next, you go home, you become an academic, you go to graduate school, but you don't do a revolution. Right? People who do revolutions tend to not highlight the question of consequences too much, at least. And that question, of course, comes later. Right? The emphasis on action and the present moment. Right? And this is really fundamental, right, for revolutionary consciousness, right? And without which we cannot really kind of understand the revolutionary process itself. Not so much the question of what happens afterwards. And that is because revolutions are based on the willingness to act, basically, and rather than on what to expect. If you were, for example, hanging out in Tahrir Square between January 28th and February 11th, you had no idea how long you were going to be there. Right? That it could be forever. Right? And the people who hang out in Yemen in the Medan al-Taghir, they, again, at the beginning, from day one, they had no idea how long they were going to be there. Perhaps they did not think that it was going to be a year, right? And so on. The important thing is to start a dynamism, a new kind of dynamism, right, so to speak, whose end result you cannot see, right, and is unpredictable, and to be prepared, of course, for sacrifice in the process, right, without necessarily reaching your conclusion, right, so to speak. So it is not about rejecting realism, necessarily, but rejecting the thinking about realism in terms of consequences, or knowing the consequences in advance, as organized, rational, so to speak, political parties and leaders would do. Right. Now, to sum up, and I don't know how much time I have, but I have a few points left to kind of, and these two things actually, thinking in terms of evaluating revolutions in terms of associations, their associations, rather, in terms of what's happening on the ground, and in terms of consequences, are really, are in fact, you see in them in the Arab world, but they typify the non-revolutionary kind of ways of thinking about the revolution. And perhaps, in some extent, one can say this is really part of the old kind of nationalist consciousness rather than the new patriotism. Now, there are a few main other differences that I want to highlight between the old nationalism and the new patriotism, briefly, beyond what has been described so far, and it seemed to be the main ideological differences. That is, whereas the old nationalism tended to highlight defense against external danger and seemed to be associated with the struggle against colonialism. Sort of understandably, the question of defense against external danger was very important. There was in it a propensity for militarism, dictatorship, and also low interest in democracy, because the priority was not on those things, but rather on defense, sort of against external enemies. By contrast, the new patriotism highlights defense against something else, against internal decomposition of society. Without losing sight, of course, of the question of external danger. They're still there, but of course more important is another danger which is more internal, so to speak. And I think it is the kind of danger that has been noted earlier by Islamic movements, say from the late 70s until now, but now it is actually in the new pictures a much more widespread kind of feeling, and does not necessarily take a religious kind of dimension by all people. Third, from the point of view of the new patriotism, lines of division in society are seen to be more artificial than seen before, including sectarian kind of divisions. And in Egypt, of course, the notion, and people do talk about as a homogeneous society, but we forget the very serious, right, kind of sectarian kind of problem, right, that people were talking about before the revolution, the bombing of the Coptic church in Alexandria and so on, and also how the performance of Muslim Coptic unity was a conscious really part of the performances that you saw during the Egyptian revolution. Not only class rejecting kind of sectarian sort of divisions, which one can also understand even in Yemen, basically, where for much of the revolution, for example, certain lines of divisions, for example, the north-south divide basically lost salience for as long as the revolution was going on, right, is also something to be noted, right? Whereas in Bahrain, it's not a question of military use of the military or what have you, right? But the question is that the ability of the regime, right, to portray kind of the opposition as a Shia rebellion rather than as a unified national non-sectarian rebellion was crucial, let's speak, even though here we are talking about the majority of the population, right? But nonetheless, right, that is something that's kind of seemed to go against the spirit of the new patriotism as being above sectarian divisions and therefore appear to be against the petty calculations, right? of kind of other actors and on the scene, because ultimately part of the spirit of the new patriotism, if it is to be compelling enough, it has to do with the fact that it is against petty kind of way of thinking about the world, including, so of course, sectarian calculations, as you see, for example, still predominates in a place like Lebanon, for example, or to a certain extent in Iraq as well. Now, that rejection of a question of division in society, that also applies to class analysis. One of the things that are intriguing about these revolutions, and in particular in terms of their connection to the new patriotism, is how little attention there is to the class issue. Right? With all due respect to what Joel Biden was saying, which I think is worthy of being pursued, but the revolutions were ultimately not about against neoliberalism or against any particular class, at least not in their immediate language, but against corruption. Okay. The corruption of the system, and against and for a new form, right, of sort of national community, right, that will give it some sort of organic solidity and coherence. In Jacobian building, for example, right, the novel pre-revolution, one of the things that we forget about is that the synthesis at the end, right, is really when the old pre-Nasser aristocrat, right, is unified with this peasant woman, right? And I think this was actually one of the, is something that's fundamental to understanding the spirit of the new patriotism, this longing for an element of the old order, right, a pre-1948 order, right, a pre-free officers kinds of movement, but sort of in a way that is repentant, right, and sort of brings out some kind of a sense of responsibility for other classes. Right? So there is a socio-economic dimension, right, but not the kind of dimension that can be really captured in a kind of a classical leftist analysis, so to speak. And finally, there is the question of how in both the old nationalism and the new patriotism, there is a sense of pan-Arabism that's still there and is clearly imagined, but in different way, whereas in the old nationalism, the sense of pan-Arabism was driven by an orthodox kind of unitary vision. In the new patriotism, it is driven by a sense of a practical vision of a cultural unity disseminated from below by direct action. Now, in conclusion, we can speculate forever about as to where this new patriotism has come from, and perhaps we can pick this up later if there is time. But briefly, I would like to suggest a few sources which I think are important for understanding that. A part of it is response to old nationalism, as mentioned, but also part has to do with kind of a moment in time of three particular kind of ideological, so to speak, ways of thinking about social order in the Arab world: conservatism, liberalism, and anarchism. Right? The first two we know a lot about, in fact, and they seem to be very important in the political processes that happen in the post-revolutionary climates. The third we know a lot less about, I think, but it is, I think, and as I have argued before, a part of social traditions that are completely forgotten and suppressed, but come to fore as one of the tools of the revolution that make them, that had made them successful to the extent that they were successful. And I will stop here. Thank you.
I want to thank Professor Shahata and the Center and all the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I feel like it's a special privilege for me and perhaps a disadvantage for this audience. I get to sit in a group of social scientists working directly on the Middle East, and you have to listen to someone who works at a law school thinking about questions from a very macro perspective. So I apologize in advance for that. We saw some very interesting, detailed, textured ethnographies this morning, or at least discussions of conditions on the ground, and again now with Professor Bamia's presentation about the new patriotism, which I think will connect to at least one point that I hope to raise here. But I'm looking at largely the question, I think I was invited to think about how intervention intersects with uprising in the instance of the events that began in the transitions in the Arab world in 2011, and that is very much a macro question. And being an international law professor, I'm especially interested in thinking about the ways in which the new languages of intervention that have emerged over the last year and the new roles that have been occupied by regional actors like the Gulf Cooperation Council and the League of Arab States and existing institutions like the UN Security Council that historically have intervened on security matters, how these changing roles reflect a new kind of prioritization in the international system. But I also want to think about sovereignty, questions of sovereignty in the context of intervention, and to the extent that that signals popular sovereignty, I think it does connect to the question of the new patriotism. So I put together a kind of paper together with a co-author, Aziz Rana at Cornell Law School, that looks specifically at the question of U.S. policy, U.S.-driven policies around intervention and their implications for the international order and for the regional order. I'm going to give sort of a roadmap of what that paper lays out, and then turn to the more kind of specific argument around international law and how it's intersecting with developments that we see in the region right now as we imagine publics attempting to negotiate what transition looks like with or without intervention. So to start then, I'm going to start with a roadmap. I began in the paper by noting that there are two iconic images that one might think of in thinking about the events of 2011. One is the image of Hosni Mubarak being wheeled into a courtroom on a hospital bed and being tried, held accountable by, if you like, the people of Egypt as a consequence of their indigenous transition, and the other of the last moments of the life of Gaddafi, captured on cell phone video, and the idea that somehow the combination of indigenous actors and regional intervention had brought another tyranny down. So on both ends of the spectrum, the one that was allegedly deeply indigenous and the other that involved an external intervention to assist indigenous actors, we see very serious transition and so forth. So one way to think about this is a moment of very critical regime change in the region and the sort of end of authoritarianism and so forth, the topics that were addressed in the first panel, the question of durability. I think there's another way to think about it, and this is the one that is engaged with in the paper, which is that in every one of these instances, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, which are the five that are considered in the paper, and any number of others, we see intervention throughout. So intervention is something that gains international attention when it takes a particular kind of direct form involving the mobilization of forces, involving activities in particular international fora and so forth. But in the argument that we present in the paper, actually it's as much the indirect interventions, the logics of orderly transition, managed regime change and so forth that reflect the true nature that intervention has in the international system. And indeed, both Mubarak and Gaddafi are symbols of the ways in which this works. So even as Mubarak is being put through a kind of ad hoc and chaotic trial proceeding in which the outcomes and the processes are quite open to interpretation, you have individuals actually involved in the uprisings facing military trial and the ordinary mechanisms that the regime had historically used prior to 2011 and appears to plan to continue to use. And when I say the regime, I mean the regime that is continuous with the Mubarak regime minus Mubarak. So that would be the picture of managed or orderly transition that is underwritten by a particular regional order. So the question is, what is the logic that underlies that, first of all, indirect form of intervention before turning to the question of new forms of direct intervention that have been sanctified in the last year? And here I think the answer lies in logics of provisional sovereignty at the periphery. So what we argue in the paper is that the notion of sovereignty, which is a core notion in the international legal order as the kind of building block on the basis of which all other rules governing how states may interact with one another is premised, that logic is actually quite different than the norm as it's traditionally understood. So traditionally it's understood as the right of a particular population to govern its own affairs within its territory so long as it abides by particular international legal rules. And so it's a kind of shield against intervention so long as the country obeys the rules, for example, around use of force, and it is the autonomy to control affairs within the territory. And this is extremely important in a post-colonial ordering precisely because sovereignty originally in the international system as it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries was something that was exclusively the prerogative of what today we might describe as the global north, Europe, North America, the white Commonwealth, and so on, and was excluded from the world that today we might identify as the global south. The fact that sovereignty was extended beyond that is of critical importance in thinking about an international system of allegedly equal states. What we say in response to this is rather that what we have is an order of provisional sovereignty. So rather than seeing the U.S., again, returning to the point about indirect and direct intervention, rather than seeing the U.S. as engaging in direct intervention in cases like Libya and Syria and abstaining from intervention in cases like, say, Bahrain and Yemen, we argue that, in fact, there's a single consistent strategy which involves using the opportunities that have arisen as a result of indigenous changes on the ground in the Arab world to either consolidate a preferred regional order in one instance, which is to say to rally behind existing allies and come up with strategies through which their relative control of their regime maintenance, political system, and so forth is assured through ideas like orderly transition or managed transition, and on the other hand, capitalize on the instability faced by adversaries in order to engage in strategies of regime change that had already been well underway before 2011. The consistency between these two, in addition to the obvious one, which is the pursuit of a particular understanding of American strategic interest, which is premised on a particular regional order, is this underlying doctrinal norm, in our view, of provisional sovereignty. So provisional sovereignty here, we mean that the kind of sovereignty accorded, in this instance, to Middle Eastern actors or Arab actors is one that can be constrained wherever states fall out of step with the demands of a regional order premised on external priorities, so what we call Pax Americana for the purposes of the paper. So reform is supported where it serves U.S. interests and as long as the cost is minimal to, and here I say U.S. Because we focus on U.S. policies, but in fact we mean by this the international order that serves various kinds of geostrategic interests that are broadly aligned with the West, so in contrast to, say, other aspiring hegemonic actors like Russia and China, but not exclusive to the United States alone. So the U.S. intervenes in every context. If allies are threatened, the deployment of covert intelligence and military assistance, a shift in strategy constraining the range of permissible outcomes when those kinds of covert assistance fail, and insistence on moderation in circumstances where allies have been weakened, and by contrast, where adversaries are threatened, the use of explicit force against them. This idea of regional order that's premised on not what's actually happening, the demands that are coming from the indigenous population, but rather a set of external priorities to be defended against or entrenched through new factors that are occurring on the ground is, in our view, the very essence of provisional sovereignty. So the idea that the sovereignty of actors in the region, and here I mean not just sovereignty, the international legal term, but also popular sovereignty, the entitlement of peoples on the street to make demands of their local governments, of their regimes, that are independent of international and regional priorities of structure, organization, security, and so forth, is very much constrained by preferences that are being policed through the international order. So then the important question is, do the uprisings provide an opportunity to defend self-determination or the ideas of popular sovereignty against this logic of provisional sovereignty? And that's really the question that we turn to in the remainder of the paper. First, we look at the practical effects of the provisional sovereignty mechanism, namely the attempted restabilization of preferred regional order. In particular, we look at the logic of the axis of moderation, which was introduced by the Bush administration, and ways in which the Obama administration has pursued a very similar strategy in trying to rally a particular kind of front in the Arab world against perceived regional adversaries, and how that is then intersecting with events that take place in somewhere like Syria, where the opportunity appears to be both the possibility of having a more friendly regime in place, but also of weakening other actors regionally that are perceived to be adversaries, in that instance, Iran, clearly. Or in the case of Libya, which was relatively peripheral to the regional order that is premised on, the geostrategic interest that we identify, you nonetheless have an opportunity to remove an irritant, which I think is a better description of the Gaddafi regime than adversary in the case of the perspective of Western powers, but to put in place a kind of regime that might be more friendly to the order that is being defended through these ideas of intervention. So against this, if we're saying, is there an opportunity here to defend a fuller conception of popular sovereignty, the question is, what would that look like? We think it would look like a recentering of the regional order around indigenous preferences rather than international priorities defended by local clients. And vocabularies of transnational solidarity that have emerged indicate that on the ground there is also a recognition that the demands here are demands to reclaim the right to be self-determining in the meaningful sense of determining of the political orientation of the given state, but also of sort of a transnational set of priorities that have been set by actors that are in alliance with local client regimes, but not centering their preferences around the centering their preferences around the demands of indigenous populations. So to the extent that we see vocabularies of transnational solidarity, and again, this was raised by Professor Bamia, they're based on recognition of common conditions, like the gaps between the rulers and the ruled, particularly in places where the rulers are being supported through external assistance from the outset, so prior to 2011 and then throughout the transitions that occurred in 2011. Similarly, the relationships between kleptocracy and neoliberalism, these are all themes, again, these are set at a very broad, I'm describing this at the highest possible order level of abstraction, and I repeat my apology for that, but the idea being that there are trends in the region that have been identified by actors on the ground in very disparate circumstances, but nonetheless that see a common condition governing the disparate outcomes that they're experiencing, whether they're in Egypt or Syria or Yemen or Bahrain, identifying similar kinds of problems and making similar kinds of demands. That, to me, is the logic of indigenous preferences that dictates, A, the development of new transnational vocabularies of solidarity that are distinct from an old Arab nationalism, and again, I defer to Professor Bania's presentation, but are nonetheless recognizing the presence of some kind of a regional identity around conditions that are being resisted and around the demands that are being articulated. Okay, so if that's what popular sovereignty might look like, then what is it that we're seeing in the emerging international order, and how would it interact with those kinds of demands? I mean, the international order formally is premised on precisely this, self-determination, the right of peoples on the ground to determine the political form of their government and to determine the policies that are adopted for their territory through the concept of sovereignty. And yet what we see instead in 2011 is a resistance to the idea that we're going to recenter around popular sovereignty, and instead the reframing of the international concept of sovereignty around a doctrine that first emerged in the sort of last 7 years called responsibly protect. And some of you this may be resonant with, but for most I think it's a pretty arcane doctrine. But I'm going to now sort of take you through a very basic outline of what sovereignty typically means in the international system, what it has come to mean under responsibly protect, and the implications for the possibility of uprising without intervention under these conditions. So sovereignty historically, as I mentioned earlier, means the system in which a state is entitled to autonomy in the conduct of its own internal affairs, so long as it does not violate the rule of non-aggression. So the UN system, the post-World War II international legal order, is premised on this idea. States are entitled to non-interference so long as they do not engage in acts of aggression, and that's precisely the set of rules that the UN Security Council is intended to police. If they do engage in an act of aggression, then the Security Council is authorized to issue a call for collective action against that state in order to reverse the act of aggression. So the classic example of this is 1991 Iraq War. You have the Iraqi government accused of having violated these terms by engaging in an aggression against Kuwait. The Security Council authorizes the use of force. It is used to reverse that act of aggression and so forth. That's the classic picture of sovereignty. The idea that's been introduced in the last 7 years is that actually sovereignty should have two faces. One shouldn't understand sovereignty strictly as a shield against international intervention so long as a country respects the international rules. One should also understand sovereignty as a form of responsibility, specifically a responsibility to protect the welfare of the civilian population on the territory. And if the sovereign in that territory fails to meet this responsibility, then their sovereignty is compromised precisely in the same way that it would be should they violate the rules of use of force. So you now have two dimensions, an external dimension to sovereignty and an internal dimension. The external dimension is you do not commit acts of aggression. If you do so, the international community is authorized to intervene. Internal dimension, you have to protect the welfare of your civilian population. If you fail to do so, again, the international community is authorized to intervene. This is a secondary responsibility that lies in the international community to protect the welfare of civilian populations that are endangered when their own sovereign fails to engage in that protection. This is a core idea at the heart of responsibly protect. And what it means in practice, or what we've seen it mean in the last year, is a kind of argument from humanitarianism that displaces politics on the ground and depoliticizes questions and relocates sovereignty away from circumstances on the ground and indigenous populations to an international order that can make determinations about what the demands of the welfare of the civilian population are. Now, this first played out in Libya. I'll just say very briefly something about this. I think one of the reasons I was actually invited to address you at the symposium is that I took a strong position that the intervention in Libya, which was entirely legal as an international law matter, was a very dangerous precedent that is extremely damaging both to the international security order and to, I think, ultimately the fate of the Libyan uprising. So what happened in Libya? For the first time ever, the UN Security Council issued a resolution authorizing a use of force against a state entirely on internal grounds. Historically, the Security Council, and under its mandate in the UN Charter, has to find a threat to international peace and security in order to authorize the use of force. And so what that generally means is that resolutions are issued that say things like, due to the threat to international peace and security, or acting under our Chapter 7 mandate, which is the chapter of the Charter that refers to threats to international peace and security, we authorize the following. In this instance, they said, because out of the interest of our responsibility to protect the civilian population, we authorize the following use of force. And then that force that was authorized, as many of us know, involved an alleged no-fly zone, which was expanded into a no-drive zone, which ended up being essentially an aerial assault on Libya in coordination with opposition forces on the ground. Now, the problem with this particular model of intervention is it's premised on the welfare of the humanitarian welfare of the civilian population. And yet what we saw in the specifics of the Libya precedent was that there was almost no attention paid to that particular question. The intervention was justified in terms of an imminent threat to the civilian population, specifically in Benghazi. And the claim there was that some 500,000 people were at risk of being massacred by the Gaddafi regime should the intervention not go forward. There's been plenty of argument around the empirical basis for that claim, but what's more interesting to note is that that counterfactual of the number of deaths that might occur in the event of non-intervention is juxtaposed with a total failure to, in fact, interrogate the actual number of civilian deaths that did occur following the intervention. So we know that as of the time of the intervention, there were approximately 1,700 to 2,000 deaths that had occurred in Libya. The current numbers that are available, not because the interveners chose to look at the numbers, but because the Transitional National Council itself, through its Ministry of Health, has made an attempt to calculate what the civilian casualties might have looked like following the intervention, is on the order of 30,000 to 50,000. That is to say, a 20,000 person margin of error for starters, and a massive acceleration of the death toll as compared to the first month of the uprising, which was allegedly the bloodiest, because that was the month in which the Gaddafi regime was able to operate unfettered, not facing aerial assault against a very poorly armed adversary. And yet the death toll there, let's call it 2,000, is to be contrasted with the 30,000 that we see in the ensuing 6 months of intervention premised on the welfare of the civilian population. Again, another contrast that one might draw is, as we think forward about Syria and the possibility of intervention in Syria and the way that the Libyan precedent might be invoked, is at a time when Libya was saturated with international media presence, and there were every major news organization in the world was on the ground, we were unable to get meaningful information about the numbers of civilians actually in harm's way as a result of the events that were taking place in Libya. By contrast, in Syria, where you have a total media blackout and no major news organizations operating on the ground, we get a near day-to-day, by the unit, assessment of the numbers of civilians who are being killed. So if I were to ask, what is the number of casualties in Syria today, we would not have a give or take of 20,000 or margins of error of incredible proportions. We would have an idea that says something between 7,500 and 10,000, which is, of course, an unacceptable margin of error in and of itself, but nonetheless indicates that even in the absence of any capacity to gather information, we are able to attend to the question of the welfare of the civilian population before intervention in a way that we're not prepared to, because we're not prepared to be held accountable for external intervention's cost once the intervention is underway. Now, this is the beginning point of a critique of what does humanitarianism introduce against notions of popular sovereignty or against notions of indigenous preferences by introducing the idea that the international community or the regional order is in a better position to assess the needs and welfare of the civilian population in any given context than local actors are, and that they're able to displace the judgments made by local actors through international mechanisms. And also, what are the international mechanisms? So looking beyond the Libyan precedent, we look at Syria. Many people are very frustrated with the absence of an intervention, at least internationally authorized intervention in Syria, and yet the mechanisms that we've seen deployed with respect to the Syria case, again, reflect a very dangerous shift, in my view, in the international system in the direction of explicit authorizations for intervention that are entirely elective. So in Syria, you have basically resistance in the Security Council driven by opposition to what had happened in Libya, from China and Russia and so on. And so the Security Council has been disabled as a mechanism through which to authorize force. As a result, what we see is the development of an end run around the Security Council by privileging regional actors, by saying, you know, let's look at the judgments of the League of Arab States, let's look at the judgments of the GCC and determine what there is an appetite for or tolerance for in the region. And so now you'll see U.S. policymakers, and this is a pretty regular drip of pieces that are being placed in prominent media channels in the United States. Most recently, the one that comes to my mind is by Anne-Marie Slaughter, former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, saying, let's just act in coordination with Saudi Arabia and Qatar or whoever we identify as local actors that are prepared to engage in an intervention with or without authorization because the situation and its urgency makes that demand. This idea that we can move away from the international mechanism when it gets stymied, and I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A about why I think the UN Security Council, when it prevents an intervention in Syria at the moment, is actually acting in precisely the way that it was designed to. So it's, rather than a failure, it's simply the correct institutional outcome that one would expect given the design features of the international legal order. But nonetheless, when you decide you can do an end run around that, as was done in Kosovo previously, as was done in Iraq, and as may now be done in Syria in one form or another, you essentially disrupt the possibility of stable expectations around sovereignty for countries that are unable to defend their sovereignty against that kind of external intervention strictly at their own means. So the defense of popular sovereignty, the defense of the idea of indigenous preferences is imperiled when you have that possibility. Now, all of this would be perhaps unimportant if there was reason to think that we have an international order that roughly does a better job of defending either civilian populations or indigenous preferences than corrupt local regimes do. And I'm sure many people in this audience now are responding to the things I'm saying by saying, well, but I mean, surely we must do something, or surely it's better to do something than to tolerate, for example, the regime brutality of the Assad regime. And of course, I have great empathy for that perspective, but I think it's important to step back and look at what the nature of the doctrine is that's being put in place. This doctrine does not say wherever civilian populations are imperiled, the international community must act to protect their welfare. It says the international community may act to protect their welfare, which is to say it's an elective doctrine. So under circumstances where it happens to be the case that there are a number of potential motivating factors that would yield an intervention, this is an available doctrine in the toolkit of possible opportunities that exist in the international order to justify intervention. And where there is no political will or appetite for intervention, there is no requirement to engage in intervention. Now, where does the political will for intervention come from? That's really the question that one has to ask in thinking about whether or not intervention on the whole is doing something that's somehow better than doing nothing. And in our paper and in this argument, I want to say that the kinds of changes in the international order to respond to new demands from the ground, in the case of the Arab world in particular, which has been the locus of a lot of the security doctrines that have emerged in the post-World War II period. A lot of the international ordering around security is specifically designed to deal with stabilizing an allegedly both geostrategically important and deeply unstable region. And now we see incredible adaptation at the international level to generate new mechanisms of intervention in order to once again bring a call to order in a region around particular kinds of international and regional priorities as opposed to the priorities that are indigenously present on the ground. This, to my mind, is a deeply alarming development, and it's deeply alarming because I think that what this kind of an interventionist doctrine permits is essentially the peril of counter-revolution through international law, and I think that is more or less what we have been witnessing. So I don't tend to read from materials, but I'm just going to read one part of the conclusion that we draw, which is essentially, again, I'm just going to say one more time, it's a very macro picture because we're looking at an international order as it's adapted from the post-colonial period forward. But having said that, it's worth putting in the context of that international legal order, its historical context, what these developments have looked like. So we say at the end that even as individual regimes face the chance of protesters in their main squares, the ordering of the Middle East too has come under pressure in 2011. That pressure invites us to remember how colonial relationships were formed and their lasting legacies. The story of colonialism in the region is not merely that of the conquest of non-European peoples and the appropriation and exploitation of their lands and resources. The extraction of resources and expropriation of peoples was accompanied by justifications grounded in claims of advancing modernization, progress, and development. These idioms of external self-congratulation were designed designed to overcome contradictions between putative liberalism and imperial objectives. Those contradictions and the deployment of justificatory frameworks to reduce the dissonance that they produce are in evidence again today as the West and its regional allies confront the Arab uprisings. Rather than acquiescing in these vocabularies of orderly transition or interventionist humanitarianism, we would do well to remember the traditions from which such models emerge and embrace instead an alternative framing offered by the public protest underway across the region. And here we just come back full circle to the new patriotism. Thank you for your time.
All right, I will now open the floor to questions. We've got 2 microphones at your disposal. I will only ask that you state your name and affiliation before you ask your question. Thank you. You're first. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, again, me, Thomas Husken, University of Bayreuth. A comment to Asli concerning these numbers on the so-called body count that you presented in the case of Libya. I mean, I was there. And in the first 3 months, and particularly when the Cyrenaica was liberated from Gaddafi's troops, the loss of lives was relatively low, basically because the population supported the fighters, a significant amount of the army defected, and the revolutionary forces performed some sort of a blitzkrieg, if you like. They stormed the Katibas, and because of the support of the population, they could proceed. But then the war completely changed when they approached Ashtabia and the other parts of Libya where Gaddafi had loyal populations on his side. And of course, then the amount of casualties exploded. And the reason for the missing coverage in the media is that at this time, most of the foreign correspondents were sitting in Benghazi, and it was dangerous to go to the front. Plus, those who were at the front, particularly correspondents from Al Jazeera, systematically downplayed the number of casualties on behalf of supporters of Gaddafi. And this is only one thing I wanted to say.
Thank you, Asla, for being brilliant as always. So I want to give a concrete example of how what you explained at the abstract level is working out and ask you to comment on it because there's still the problem of what is to be done in Syria. So at Stanford last week, there was the largest ever student-led gathering on anything having to do with the Arab world. And it was organized by a Stanford student body that was originally having to do with Darfur, but now they're also dealing with civilian casualties in Syria. So attending this event are, I think I can't say his name because this part was off the record, but someone from the Policy Planning Division of the State Department, i.e. a colleague of Anne-Marie Slaughter, who said that the United States will intervene when it becomes clear and when the administration makes the argument that Syria is part of the Iran-Hamas-Hezbollah axis in the region, and therefore intervention is in the national interest of the United States. Larry Diamond, editor of the Journal of Democracy and big proponent of democratization, intervention for democratization, gave the argument that you outlined, responsibility to protect, and one Syrian on the panel also basically begged for intervention. Every other Arab in the room, and me, expressed some degree of opposition or other to intervention. And the students are horrified. Why are we against saving those people? So what are we supposed to tell them?
Okay. So I want to thank you, Thomas, I think, for the Libya, giving the additional detail about the basis for the body count. I agree entirely, and what that reflects is the following. The depiction of Libya that preceded the intervention was of victimized civilians that are united in their opposition against the Gaddafi regime facing a brutal regime. What was missing from that is that there were, of course, civilians living in all parts of Libya, not only in the eastern provinces of Libya, but that picture was never clarified. And so as a result, when casualty numbers started mounting dramatically because there were parts of the country that weren't necessarily allied with this particular cause, what you might have had under different circumstances of a relatively evenly matched set of parties would have been negotiation, right, as opposed to carnage. But what you did have instead was at the control of opposition forces a massive aerial capacity, therefore, to advance in ways that otherwise would have been very unlikely, that yields then a quick victory, and one can make some arguments about whether a quick victory is better and whether, I mean, if by the way, better and worse, these are all in terms of the logic that the doctrine itself introduces, which is effectively something on the order of civilian body count, right? I mean, it's about the welfare of the civilian population, and so better or worse is not what is the nature of the political outcome, logically is not supposed to be, but rather how many people's lives are saved in this kind of world of humanitarianism that depoliticizes the sets of actual conflicts on the ground that are fueling opposition and are leading to particular strategies being pursued by actors on the ground. So because you have this option of what you call blitzkrieg, you can go with blitzkrieg, and when you're in an area that's largely comprised of supporters, you're not going to face the possibility of very serious civilian casualties because the civilian population supports you, and you can focus that power on just the retreating military forces. But when you're in an area where the civilian population does not support the opposition, and yet there's civilians entitled to welfare, that calculus breaks down, and you have a set of external actors making judgments about whether or not it's acceptable to tolerate very high civilian casualty rates in order to accomplish what amounts to a political objective, namely regime change. Now again, many people might argue that regime change with respect to the Gaddafi regime is necessarily a net benefit. But what I'm saying is, first of all, that's not an appropriate judgment to be driven externally. But secondly, that the precedent that gets set that says the UN Security Council can use humanitarianism as a reason to pursue political objectives not related to the welfare of civilian populations is even more dangerous than just the elective doctrine of humanitarianism that I outlined previously. And Joey, thank you so much for your question, and I completely can imagine. I just have to say two things that come to my mind as I hear you describe what was said by the person from the State Department and Larry Diamond. One is another corollary of the Anne-Marie Slaughter position, which says, look, sovereignty has two faces. We can't let massacres take place in this day and age and so forth unless they're in Sri Lanka or a number of other places, and we pay no attention. But in these places that we're concentrated upon, it's impossible to tolerate this. We're civilized people, et cetera. She seems to have, and those who make these arguments seem to have no conception at all of the resonance of their claims of modernity, civilizational progress, and so forth, with the obvious 18th, 19th century developments against which this particular international legal order was constructed on the premise that that's not going to be an acceptable idiom to go forward. And she, I mean, just to make this point as clear as possible, she specifically argued in writing in response to that in August in the Financial Times at the end of when Tripoli fell, that this idea of sovereignty as a shield against intervention is just an antiquated notion because it dates to a time when local populations had more to fear from external interveners than they did from their local regimes. But now we live in a world in which local populations have more to fear from indigenous governance than they do from external intervention, and therefore we need to wholeheartedly embrace humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention because we can trust the intentions and actions of external interveners in a way that we could never do with respect to local leaders. Now, I mean, I'm obviously not a historian, and there are many historians in the room who can speak to the degree to which this captures absolutely the arguments that were produced around 18th and 19th century interventionism, also described in humanitarian terms, which was explicitly colonial. The difference here is that we now have various structures in place, largely institutions that are produced through the international order that enable one that, well, let me put it this way, that disconnect direct chains of accountability. So the difference under colonial mechanisms was local populations could address grievances at the end of the day to the metropole. They could engage in forms of resistance where they understood that the resistance was addressing that external intervener that's engaging in reordering their society and so forth. All of that is deeply obscured today in the order that we have, in which those direct chains of accountability where, metropole says, you are my colony, you are my satellite, you are my subordinate, that explicit framing is absent. And so it's much more difficult to know who's the actual addressee of the resistance. And that, of course, facilitates this kind of argument that is being produced about the capacity of external interveners to know best for indigenous populations or to intervene in ways that enhance their welfare as opposed to local actors. But in terms of what to do then, I mean, you're confronted with, people, and I can't read the minds of the audience, but I can imagine many people thinking, well, so what are you advocating? Do nothing, sit by, allow another Sri Lanka, et cetera. And I think the answer to that is to begin by saying what I said in the presentation, which is we're always already intervening. It's not a question of do something, do nothing. That binary is a completely false framing of the issue. We are doing things all the time, and the question is, what are the impacts of those things, and how do we understand their local implications? Are we in fact paying attention to what's happening on the ground? And the relationship between the ways in which we're intervening and our actual priorities. Are they in any way aligned with the priorities of folks on the ground? So one way I would try to describe this is to say, I think that the Arab uprisings represent a moment in which the United States ought to be thinking in very different terms about what actually is in its geostrategic interest in the region and redefine those interests around what local actors and indigenous populations are demanding. Why? Let's take the example of Turkey. Many people have, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the Beltway among analysts about the fact a year earlier that Turkey had turned away from this axis and done, has now turned to the east and is no longer a reliable ally and so forth. And what they were in fact bemoaning was a relatively autonomous set of policies that were emerging based on a government that actually enjoyed indigenous legitimacy in Turkey and was deeply popular and was able to compete successfully in democratic elections. What that has proved to me now, and I myself am quite critical of what the role, which I believe to be sectarian, that Turkey is playing currently, for example, in Syria. But nonetheless, Turkey is a much, much more valuable ally, ultimately, to the United States today than it was 10 years ago, precisely because it's indigenously stable, legitimate, and autonomous, and therefore it isn't likely to be toppled tomorrow because of the absence of massive amounts of Western subsidy or Western boots on the ground at a moment where the population rises up. But that can't be said, that can no longer be said of many other allies in the region, and the price to be paid for continuing to maintain this stability strategy, namely external support against indigenous preferences, as opposed to aligning around regimes that are stable by virtue of their relationship to indigenous preferences, I think is ultimately a losing one. So both from the perspective of how do we understand our interests, even if you're going to justify interventions strictly in terms of American interests, and from the perspective of what do we do if what we care about is the Darfur style, the civilian population is dying, I think the answer is to look much more critically at what it is that the United States is already doing in ways in which it's already intervening, instead of calling for some new form of external intervention in the form of finance or arms to Syria.
Ma'am, please ask a question.
Hi, my name is Vivian Salama. I've been a journalist in the Middle East for the last 8 years. My master's is also in Middle East politics. I'm curious to hear either of your thoughts on the lack of cohesion in the judiciaries in the various countries. In 2005, particularly in Egypt, in 2005, ahead of the quote-unquote re-election campaign of Hosni Mubarak, the syndicates were hopping. I mean, the judges and the lawyers were out there every single day protesting. Certainly they were very active in the days leading up to Gamal Abdel Nasser coming to power as well. Nowadays we don't have that cohesion anymore, and I'm wondering, maybe that lack of cohesion may have helped overthrow Hosni Mubarak, but how important is it in seeing a smooth transition also with regard to corruption and issues like that? How can we avoid that when we don't really have a strong judiciary? Thanks.
Well, one thing I should say about that is that one of the things that are interesting about the spaces of revolution where revolutions have actually succeeded so far, right, is that you don't have Bastille, you don't have counter-revolutionaries lined up against the wall and shot. Libya, of course, was always an exception. You don't have even any executions yet. This is rare in the history of revolutions. Right? In fact, all investigations at trials seem to use the same old, slow-moving legal system, just as the transitional period has to rely on part of the old regime in order for it to be completed, because ultimately the revolutions itself has not produced its own kind of personnel that is ready to take power immediately after the fall of the old regime, right? And that has to do a lot with the spontaneous, I think, kind of nature, right? I think like was substantially, not entirely, but substantially kind of describes the dynamism of the revolution. It's natural, I think, for spontaneous, right, so to speak, or largely spontaneous movements to be concluded by someone else, right? That is, they have to rely on part of the existing order to complete the task that you have begun. And so it's not surprising that that kind of part of the system that is being used. And also, it is, in a way, in Egypt, I think, in spite of what you call lack of cohesion, the judiciary was perhaps more trustworthy, kind of as an institution than in Tunisia, right? As sort of a relatively, not entirely, but relatively kind of independent institution, right? And was kind of tolerated. And keep in mind that part of the controversy that surrounded the November elections, the fraudulent election in 2010, was that, in fact, the judiciary was excluded from it, right? Which excluded from actually monitoring it. And when people protested that, the Mubarak regime came with the most ingenious kind of interpretation of the division of authorities, the three kind of powers that I have ever heard of, which is that the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches are completely independent of each other, meaning that the judiciary had no role in deciding on how the parliament constituted itself. Right? That was great. But ultimately, it was, although it seemed to be an assault on judiciary, that seemed to have given more credibility in the post-revolutionary phase.
I'm going to say one thing about that, just because, first of all, I mean, I refer you to the work of Tamer Mustafa and Mona al-Qabashi that have looked at the ways in which lawyers and judges' mobilization in Egypt was then interacted with regime strategies. So, for example, of altering the composition of the Supreme Constitutional Court, as an instance, and also altering the mechanisms for supervision of elections, which is, again, what was just mentioned. But I think that an interesting point to be made is precisely this idea of judicial independence. I think one should be wary of policing arguments around judicial independence in periods of democratic transition. Democratic transition, I mean, assuming that's what we're seeing, but democratic transition means transition from the rule of the few to the rule of the many. And one way that elites tend to entrench their own privileges is by having particular interpretations of new constitutions, new statutes, and so forth that guard those privileges in a set of ways. How to put it? Monitored by the judiciary, precisely because the judiciary is divided from the branches that face democratic accountability, something along those lines. So these arguments about separation of powers are not specific to Egypt. The argument that separation of powers is some kind of a doctrine that is independent of checks and balances and means that we can have judiciaries that are completely insulated from democratic process suggests that those are going to be the institutional grounds, together with the military, the unelected branches of government, are going to be the places where you shield elite privilege from democratic reversal. So one has to be wary of the ways in which courts, I think, get used in periods of transition. And again, you can look to Latin America as another instance where this was clear in the 1970s, that judiciaries that have a history of being identified in some way with, for example, military interest, the interest of the state at some level, may have some level of autonomy, may have acted in ways that created some mechanisms of political freedom, as we saw in the Egyptian case, under authoritarianism. But when there's a transition away from authoritarianism, their institutional role might shift quite dramatically, and they might become the sort of guardians of the status quo and status quo privileges in ways that are quite antithetical to the goals of an uprising.
Please identify yourself.
Hi, Anna Newby with POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. My question for Professor Bali is, what do you do when civilians ask for an intervention? I understand that it's sometimes hard to gauge to what extent that request really reflects indigenous preferences, as you call them, but assuming that that request does reflect indigenous preferences, is an intervention really just an extension of popular will?
Yeah, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. One thing that we have learned from Edward Said, I think, is that we have to listen to the people that we are talking about, right, and not simply talk talk about them, but actually talk with them. So I think actually one of the things that we have to keep in mind indeed is what people are demanding of us. And that includes even sometimes doing something that may not be, say, consistent with what international law is set up to do. That's fine. I mean, it's, we live in a dynamic world where sovereignty is not really all that useful. And in fact, I have written a book on globalization a few years ago where, in fact, I did try to follow all the ways in which sovereignty is de facto violated in the world. In Libya, I think Libya remains an exceptional case. And I don't think anyone really wants to repeat that, that experience in the Arab world. But we have to keep in mind, I think, that there was a very strong demand within Libya itself, right, for intervention, right? And that the Libyan opposition was almost united in asking for intervention. Not necessarily bombing in the way it happened, but sort of like in terms of they want more sort of something that was not satisfied, which is building their own capacity, i.e. being armed, so to speak. That you don't have that in Syria. Right? You have some people who in the opposition who want intervention and others who don't. So you don't have unity on that. But I think the problem is that the Libyan example is the one that we tend to think about when we think about this type of intervention. And I think there are so many other models that are being discussed about Syria that don't mean the same thing as happened in Libya. The idea of, for example, humanitarian corridors that have been discussed. The idea of some kind of daily ceasefire that is somewhat monitored. Anything that happens, some kind of any kind of involvement that would likely change the dynamic on the ground. But it doesn't. But basically, one of the things that are important is listening to the people themselves. One of the things, one of the demands, for example, in the Syrian opposition, that the opposition has become unanimous about that after in the last couple of weeks was the necessity of arming the opposition. And that is not the same as saying no-fly zone, or asking for outside intervention, but it is something else. And that, I think, Western powers in particular have been very reluctant to agree to actually allow people on the ground to be armed. They seem to, in fact, to be happier to bomb from themselves, and do something themselves. So I think whatever we do, it is very important, and I think very important to keep in mind what is being demanded from the people who are affected themselves, and whether there is unanimity, or credible unanimity at least among the opposition on what is demanded. And if it is intervention, so what? That's it.
So I think that you have to be careful how you define the people. So it's true that you might have unity among opposition actors, but it's not clear if opposition actors are representative of the people, whatever that may mean. Ultimately, it just depends on what the motivations are. If they're supposedly humanitarian, if the idea is lives are being lost and we need to intervene to save lives, then that's a very different calculation than an external intervention that's based on an understanding of what indigenous demands are for political change in particular, right? So it's distinct from that goal. But I do think that when I say that do something, do nothing is the binary that's proposed, the do something side of that binary is typically constrained by what is feasible that one can expect to ask of the external intervener, right? So what would they actually have the appetite or will to produce? And anything that's beyond the pale of that narrow spectrum is considered excluded because it's preposterous to expect that that's going to happen. So here's an example. I think you have a whole spectrum of things that could be done in Syria. Let's say humanitarian corridors. I think actually that was proposed in Libya as well, at both the Egyptian and Tunisian borders, that you would have some kind of humanitarian corridor set up. It was a short-lived proposal, and I think it'll probably be pretty short-lived in Syria too, because there's no distinction between that proposal and more direct forms of intervention, since you have to be able to defend the corridor in order for it to actually serve the purpose of protecting civilians, and then you also have to be able to defend it against being used as an outpost by opposition forces that are armed in order to maintain the alleged civilian character of that, which means ultimately an accelerating use of force in order to maintain the definition of the corridor. And this problem arose in Bosnia previously, and in fact, Bosnia is very instructive. I think what we're seeing in Syria today is very much on the model of what happened in Bosnia, which is In fact, I would say that Syria is a combination of what 1990s Iraq and 1990s Bosnia in terms of how the international system is reacting. On the one hand, containment, sanctions, put up a wall, travel restrictions, and so forth for the regime. And on the other hand, funneling of arms, which is the Bosnia model, and not largely through Western countries, which I don't think actually have an appetite for bombing in directly, but similarly to Bosnia, where the U.S. official position was that we're not providing arms to the Bosnian Muslims and that we're going to maintain an arms embargo. In fact, the United States was in coordination with Turkey and Saudi Arabia, actors that are once again being mobilized today around the Syria question, funneling massive amounts of arms and funds into Bosnia. The result, if you do that, which is you impose containment, you put up a big wall around a country, and then you pour a lot of arms into that country, is of course an acceleration, fueling of civil war. Now that might ultimately produce political change that is in favor of what opponents of the regime would want, I mean regime change in particular, but at what cost? I mean, that's the question. So what are then the alternatives to that model, which is I think the one that's currently being pursued internationally? I think the alternative, for example, is to put genuine pressure on the Syrian regime, a la what happened in the case of Yemen. Now, is that a positive, wonderful outcome? No. I mean, what is Yemen? Yemen is immunity for transition and barely even transition, right? So it's like, let's find a soft landing exit strategy for the regime that barely even removes the regime, but at least removes the hated figure and introduces the possibility of some kind of change, but at a much lower cost in terms of ultimate civilian deaths than what we can anticipate if a full civil war results in regime change. So how could you have that soft landing in Syria? People say it's impossible. There's no way to negotiate with the Assad regime. It has its back against the wall. The Alawite community faces massive reprisals if they were to step down and so forth. The answer to that question is engaging with the actual allies of the Syrian regime, namely, in this instance, Russia and Iran, and not engaging with them by shaming them or insisting that it's the moral thing to do to come to the table and demand a stop to the carnage, because, of course, all of them have access to the same histories I'm recounting, and they'll say Sri Lanka and 1,000 other examples where carnage was not in any way used as a moral lever to bring any party to the table. Rather, you have to actually offer incentives, things that they want to bargain about. Iran's nuclear program, Russia's energy relationships with Europe, things that come with political costs that mean spending actual capital of those parties that want to intervene in defense of civilians and so forth in order to incentivize the other actors to come to the table and share that set of goals. Now, when I say that, people say that's ridiculous, preposterous. What, you were going to negotiate on the Iranian nuclear program in order to get Iran to bring Syria to the table? Yeah, maybe that sounds ridiculous. But to my mind, to say that we're going to save lives by funneling arms into the country is more preposterous, for starters. And the idea that that's ridiculous is basically indexed against the amount of political capital we're prepared to spend as opposed to what's actually feasible in the international system. In the international system, one might think multilateral negotiation is the way that you bring an end to a conflict where multiple regional parties are players in addition to the domestic actors on the ground. So that, to my mind, is a more meaningful form of intervention.
Thank you for your patience. You have the last question, so please.
Yes, Randa Kayale from George Mason University, Cultural Studies PhD student. My question actually is directed towards Dr. Bama. I am very interested in the concept of cultural ramifications from the Arab uprisings. And you mentioned that there was a certain pan-Arabism that was sort of Nasserist, that had sort of morphed and changed as a result of the Arab uprisings. And I would like you to expand a little bit on that and perhaps address also if you see the new patriotism as patriarchal.
One of the clearest things about the Arab uprising is the power of example, namely that is clearly there is a regional consciousness in the sense that they are obviously inspiring each other. On the first day of the Egyptian revolution, one of the first things you saw in Tahrir Square was the Tunisian flag, and then the Palestinian flag as well, and then the Libyan flag and so on. So there is a consciousness that the uprisings are part of regional spirits, and not just kind of about national dictators. There is also a consciousness of a similarity of fate, namely that the Arab regimes against which these revolutions are directed are similar to each other, in the way they stand vis-a-vis the population, basically. Dictatorial, dynastic, corrupt, all that. So there is that, so there is a sense of common kind of regional purpose, and common identity, and common sense of the kind of problems that we are facing. But there's no expectation of a savior kind of leader figure who will stand in for the nation as a whole. What you have is some kind of a practical consciousness from below, an exchange of information, exchange of from Tunisia, for example, to Egypt, about practical things, namely how to protect yourself against tear gas, right? Stuff like that. So there is, so what I'm talking about is, a lot of that is facilitated by new media. And again, I'm one of those people who did not want to highlight the new media too much, but I think clearly they have an influence in terms of disseminating some kind of consciousness about similarity of conditions from below, right, rather than from above. And there is no, and also the power example, the repetition of slogans that you see, and also the structure, right, the ideological kind of structure of the revolutions, namely the questions of unity, right, at least national unity, the questions of common purpose, and so on and so forth. Now, that is all I think we can say about that. Palestine remains very important, as far as I could see, for all Arabs. And even though it's not the cause of these rebellions, but it is actually, but the discourse about Palestine, right? It kind of permeates kind of this revolutionary consciousness in ways that we can kind of document and go on about forever. But the question of patriarchy, again, the main features of this new patriotism are not detailed enough yet, and what I try to sketch today are really what is observable so far. Is it patriarchal? I don't think so, but it could be. Right? Because what you have is a convergence of multiple traditions, right, in the revolutionary moment. Right? Part of this new patriotism comes from a liberal kind of consciousness that has emerged and is visible in new kind of movements that you see emerging in the 2000s, Kifaya, and so on, and what have you. But also, a great part of it is conservative and traditional, right? And you see it basically in forces that are established in society that are, in fact, turning out to be the beneficiaries, the political beneficiaries of the kind of the post-revolutionary period in Tunisia and Egypt in particular. Those are part of the revolution as well. Right? So whether it is patriarchal or not, I think this question is probably a little bit more detailed than we can answer right now. One can say is that within new patriotism, you would have both patriarchal and non-patriarchal or anti-patriarchal kind of tendencies. Because patriarchy in itself is not enough of a definition, right, of a national consciousness. It's a definition of a particular kind of tradition, right, within a society. But in itself, people don't do a revolution because they want to be patriarchal or anti-patriarchal. They do it for purposes that appear to be a lot more common than that. Often, especially in revolutions that seem to come from below entirely, right? Often and there's no vanguardist ideology, right, that points them to a new future. Often the ideology, the cultural, the social practice and the ideologies that predominate in the post-revolutionary period may resemble the kind of, or may be closer to the kind of a traditional life, so to speak, about which there is a consensus. But that is not set in stone either. It could be patriarchal. But that is, as I say, it does not. The new patriotism does not depend on that. It is not really part of this, kind of what seems to be essential for it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to extend my thanks to our very thought-provoking and I guess somewhat provocative speakers today. Thank you very much.